Adele Perry Nadishnikas, Gawin ni Dudimsi, Winnipeg Nundiji, Zaganash Kwe Nindaw. My name's Adele Perry. I don't know my clan. I live in Winnipeg and I'm a white and settler woman. I am a historian at the University of Manitoba. I also work in the departments of Women and Gender Studies, and I have the very real honor of being the director of the Center for Human Rights Research. And it is with that hat on that we are welcoming you today to this roundtable. Commemoration matters, and this will be a discussion of history, of human rights, of historical and ongoing wrongs, and the politics of commemoration. And we are broadcasting to you from Winnipeg, the territories of the Anishinaabe, the Innu, and the Métis people, governed by the promises of Treaty 1 and also of the Manitoba Act. I don't think there's any question that the year of 2020 will be one that is remembered, discussed, and argued about for some time. We and those who come after us will, of course, focus on the global, devastating, but also revealingly differential impact of COVID-19. This has been a year where the historical agency of a virus has been made and continues to be made so clear. I think we will also remember this year as one where ongoing conversations about history, about commemoration, and human rights took significant turns, prompted by social movements including Black Lives Matter and Land Back. People have engaged the ways that commemorative practices on both sides of the Atlantic, in spaces both colonized and colonizing, refract and kind of calcify politics of anti-Blackness, of anti-Indigenous racism, and of colonialism. So it is a good way for the Center for Human Rights Research to finish off this year of 2020 by assembling what I think is very clearly an all-star panel of historians and historical scholars to speak on the provocative and sometimes vexed connections between rights, wrongs, histories, and commemoration. We have 4 speakers, and we're going to proceed actually in reverse alphabetical order. I'll introduce each of the speaker, who will then speak for about 5 minutes. We'll then go on to the next speaker. Once all of the 4 speakers are done, we will have conversation amongst the panel, and then we will open up the conversation to our esteemed audience and take questions via the chat box. So I'll also just note, I know that there's a possibility of a couple of classes that may be joining us online. So if you are part of a class or you're a teacher of a class that have been able to join us today, give us a shout out in the chat box, and hopefully we can speak directly to some of the things that group might be bringing to this discussion. But I'll just begin by introducing our first speaker, who's Omeasoo Wāhpāsiw. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Education at the University of Prince Edward Island. She is coming to us from the farthest east and the latest in time zones. She is a historian with a PhD from the University of Saskatchewan, comes from Cree territories, and we are enormously honored to have her joining us in this conversation. And so I will turn things over to Professor Wāhpāsiw.
Yeah, thank you. And also very grateful to the Mi'kmaq for allowing me to be on their traditional unceded territory, Bigwit, the traditional district of Mi'kmaq. So thank you all for allowing me to exist all around. Okay, so this title took me on a long journey, actually. Presumably, I was asked to speak to this audience because of my loud mouth, speaking out from PEI, the Mi'kmaq district of Abegwit, saying, "Painting on statues is art. Vandalizing and defacing public symbols of this nation is an important act of democratic protest. Symbolically, it demonstrates that we are not all happy with what Sir John A. Macdonald represents." So today, instead of thinking about Sir John A. Macdonald, who, as I have said, was just a man, I thought about death. Of course, in the middle of a pandemic, that's what I thought about. For the most part, it is in dying that we are commemorated. And then I started thinking about how I wanted to be commemorated, what was important to me to leave as my legacy. It was not a statue or a marker or any of my written work. It is not a pile of cash to pay for what my children and great-grandchildren could ask for. It's not even my name. If my great-grandchild hears one story about me, And it is a story of love, of value, of equality with beings, human and non, empathy and care. And if that child can laugh and pray and play and know that I did too with them in my heart, that is what commemoration is to me. In my research on how Nehio and Dene people grieved in the early 1800s during the fur trade era, families avoided sites of death for a certain number of years, refused to cooperate with capitalist enterprises, also known as gathering furs for the fur trade, and purposefully starved and impoverished themselves. Through these trying times in families, they depended on their extended kinship networks through a Gutwin, as discussed at length by Métis scholar Brenda McDougall, to ensure that they themselves did not also make their final journeys. Extended family members were responsible to feed and clothe their grieving relatives. This type of commemoration was meaningful spiritually, emotionally, intellectually, and physically, and yet it left no mark. The oral history that may have told me if these were amongst my ancestors was all there was, and of course that has been erased. Similarly, at the unveiling of a cloth with the 2,800 children who met their deaths while in the state care of residential schools, then Truth and Reconciliation Commissioner Rai Moran shared that these are only known names. At least another 1,600 died with their names still yet to be told. In Alberta, Musqueam First Nation and residential school, with the help of archaeologist Dr. Keisha Supernant, shared that at that very site, quote, in the records, there were 35 children who were unaccounted for that disappear off the records and nobody quite knows what happened, end quote. By now, we understand that Sir John A. Macdonald is the fall guy for these deaths, despite the many people who clamored for his work, primarily the railway, that both built this nation and instigated the speedy destruction of not only these children, but environmental devastation and multiple generations of Indigenous peoples. Unfortunately, this continues today, attested to in Canada's own court system. In November 2020, CBC reported that Canada has spent $3.2 million fighting St. Anne's residential school survivors since 2013. In 2018, an APTN News investigation reported that, quote, 102 Indigenous kids connected to the child welfare system in Ontario died over a 5-year period. In Manitoba, over an 11-year period, 652 kids who had some contact with the child welfare system within the past year of their life died. Manitoba has more than 10,000 children in care, and 90% of them are Indigenous, end quote. In 2016, a Canadian Human Rights Tribunal case found Canada guilty of discrimination against Indigenous children in regards to appropriate child welfare and ordered the nation to pay $40,000 to each victim. But even worse, the total number will continue to climb as, quote, because of the rising number of expected apprehensions, end quote. Yet it is the commemoration of Sir John A. Macdonald that has many Canadians concerned over the destruction of his legacy through some various creative approaches to a statue. According to Maclean's article, statues of John A. Macdonald are only in the range of 10 across Canada, and this may be down to 9. Meanwhile, the Yellowhead Institute, a First Nations think tank, described that the fulfilling of call to action number 72, quote, develop and maintain the National Residential School Student Death Register created by the TRC are, like those completed in previous years, more performative and procedural than substantive or structural changes. This is really a microcosm of the last 4 years of the federal government's relationship with Indigenous people. Hard work on the symbols while avoiding the substance, end quote. So, from my perspective, Canada, keep your statues. Build 9 statues for every single child lost in the residential school system, including all of those of us with intergenerational impacts. Drown this continent in symbols of survivance from capitalism and oppression. Or in this unprecedented juncture in our lifetimes, let us all learn to depend on our extended families. Throw off the shackles of capitalist and land greed and join each other in charity, hunger, and the cold starkness of having little, while we gain a lot more in this new family a new family that might have the honor of being called Canada.
Thank you very, very much for that really powerful and insightful and sharp analysis to start us off in this conversation. It's really brought a lot to this, and a good way to begin. So we are working on trying to figure out how to turn off the ding-dinging. We have received some very helpful advice in the chat box. Thank you to those that are have that knowledge, and we'll continue to work on that. But in the meantime, we can also, I guess, just learn to live with it as well. I'm going to move on to our next speaker that we are honored to have join us, and that is Melanie Newton, who is here joining us from Toronto, from the University of Toronto. And Dr. Newton is a historian of the Caribbean and the Atlantic world. She is the author of a really fantastic book that you should all read called The Children of Africa and the Colonies, Free People of Color in Barbados in the Age of Emancipation. And also a number of recent works on the connections between genocide, Indigenous dispossession, and slavery in the Americas. And we are really grateful that she is able to join us. So I will turn things over to Professor Newton.
Thank you so much for the invitation. Are you all hearing me okay? Yeah, okay. I really appreciate it. It's wonderful to be part of this conversation. And thank you to Omeasoo for that amazing 5 minutes, which I will try so hard to follow. It'll be challenging. It was really wonderful. And it made me think in terms of what I would say. I actually rethought things just slightly to follow on. And I wanted to start by discussing not the statue that I'm going to sort of focus on primarily in my short presentation, but the space that the presence of that statue and the history that represents it has actually made precarious. So there is an island. It's in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. I'm a historian of the Caribbean. My work is on the southeastern Caribbean islands. I guess it would have been helpful to have a map for those of you who are not accustomed to looking at maps of the Caribbean, but it's in the southeastern Caribbean. And the island of St. Vincent, which is the main island of this multi-island state, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, was the Indigenous home of people whom Europeans came to call by a catch-all term that is the nucleus of the name for the entire region, which is the Caribbean. So these are the people who they call, the colonial name was the Carib people, who were in fact many different Indigenous peoples. One of whom in the early colonial period was an Afro-Indigenous people called the Garifuna people. So the Garifuna at the end of the 18th century were hunted down and slaughtered by the British, who destroyed villages, killed families, killed children in order to claim this island, which they had earmarked for the next phase of the expansion of plantation slavery. And the problem in St. Vincent was that the island, about half of the island at the end of the 18th century, was still controlled by the Garifuna people. And the British viewed the Garifuna not just as a challenge to slavery, not just the challenge because as Indigenous people, they laid claim to half of this territory, but also because as people of African heritage also, Afro-Indigenous people really challenged a lot of the fundamental racial assumptions on which slavery was based. So they hunted down the Garifuna. This was a planned killing. There was an MP who had financial interest on the island of St. Vincent, who basically wrote a blueprint for this genocide in 1795 called the Account of the Black Caribs, as the British called them. And they exiled survivors on one of the islands in the Grenadines, an island called Wāhpāsiw, which is a tiny island. It is basically a desert, literally a desert island. It has no running water. It has no natural forest cover, nothing. It's a really barren rock. It's quite small. The British turned it into a death camp. They interred more than 5,000 people there. Nearly half of them died within about 9 months, and they exiled the survivors to Central America. And this is where many of today's Garifuna people live. And the people who remained on St. Vincent, and they also separated people according to lightness and darkness of skin color. They exiled those of darker complexion on the grounds that they were not truly Indigenous because they were really African and therefore did not have a right to remain in St. Vincent. And the descendants of those who then were, quote unquote, allowed to remain in St. Vincent had to survive in British ruled St. Vincent, which was a slaveholding society, and their descendants still live in the most impoverished and remote areas of the country. So this island, Wāhpāsiw Island, is sacred to the Griffin people, but it is currently, if you look online, if you happen to have $30 million lying around that you don't currently have any plans for, you can purchase this island for the small, low price of $30 million and build your dream vacation home. You should probably double that, though, to get running water, to, you know, like, it's ridiculous that this island is for sale. But it also has no protection. It's privately owned, and the owners have it for sale for this price. The government of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, very poor government, does not have the money to pay for it. It's also a government that, even though it acknowledges the importance of the Indigenous history in St. Vincent, again, there's a lot of symbol and little substance. It has not reformed the curriculum around how Indigenous histories of St. Vincent are taught. They still teach children a lot of the problematic colonial narratives around cannibalism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that has not been changed despite all of these symbolic acknowledgements, which I think sounds pretty familiar. So all of that to say, this island, its status is precarious, even though it's arguably one of the most clearly and historically identifiable sacred spaces in the Caribbean that has immense meaning for people of both African and Indigenous heritage in the region. And we contrast the relative absence of any serious debate in the Caribbean about the status of this island with the debate in Scotland about the statue of the person who was, at the time of this genocide, the Minister for War and Colonies for the British Empire, a fellow by the name of Henry Dundas, who was created Lord Melville in his lifetime after he was actually impeached by the government for various nefarious deeds. But he basically was the one who ordered this genocide against the Garifuna. And he was also the person who, in 1792, introduced a policy called Gradual Abolition, which he claimed was an abolitionist policy, but was actually, it's a bit like if you were the government telling people, you have, I don't know, an unspecified number of years left to traffic cocaine, and then we're going to abolish it. What's going to happen? You know, the coke dealers are not just going to go home. So this is exactly what happens with the transatlantic slave trade, in that the years when after Dundas introduced this measure, are actually most of the highest years in terms of volume of human trafficking of the slave trade. And the policies, the measures that he suggested were not actually about abolishing slavery. It was precisely about reforming slavery, mainly to encourage the birth of children. So harnessing the reproductive powers of women to actually increase the enslaved population without recourse to the slave trade, and to give slave owners time to make that transition. This was not an abolitionist measure. So the debate in Scotland, which is an incredibly important debate about this statue, which towers over Edinburgh, is incredibly important. But it really does focus on these debates in Parliament about his measure, and hasn't until recently thought about this question of the range of the scale of the violence. It's not just the slave trade, but the genocide against the Garifuna, genocides against the Maroons in Jamaica, which were also carried out under Dundas's watch, that this was a regime at a pivotal moment of Britain's history that committed itself deeply to slavery's expansion. And we live with the consequences of his particular decisions to this day. So in terms of commemorations, I think it's important when we debate, say, statues like John A. Macdonald and so on, just as the previous speaker mentioned, there are these other forms of commemoration and these silences, these other spaces like Wāhpāsiw Island that are invisible and precarious precisely because of the way that the debate, like, it's important that the debate not just be framed about the statues that are already there, but what kinds of commemorations would actually pay real respect to the past and speak more to who we would like to be in the present.
Thank you very, very much for that. really rich and remarkable introduction. And I think tying these different kind of questions around politics and what is asked, what is not asked, what is discussed, what is not discussed, when we engage these questions of commemoration in different colonial spaces and in different post-colonial ones. So thank you very much, Professor Newton, for that. I will introduce our third speaker, who we are honored to have joining us, and that is Professor Laura Madokoro. And Laura is an associate professor of history at Carleton University. She is a historian of refugees and migration and is currently working on histories of sanctuary. And I'll also note that Laura is a member of the Active History Editorial Collective, and this is a source for a lot of really interesting critical scholarship on history and commemoration. And I will point you all to it in general and to a series that is run this week in particular, which has a three-part series written by Drs. Mary Jane Logan McCallum at the University of Winnipeg and Dr. Christine Alexander, and deals with many of the questions that today's roundtable is engaging as well. So with that, I will turn things over to Laura.
Thank you, Adele, and hi everyone, bonjour. I am speaking to you today from my home in Ottawa, which is on the traditional territory of the Algonquin Nation, and it really is such a pleasure to be here and to have a chance to share some ideas. I've been jotting down notes and I sort of feel like my brain cells are just sparking. Thanks, Omeasoo and Melanie, for your opening comments. And Adele took some of my fire, because as I was watching all the faces pop up on the screen, I saw Dr. Christine Alexander's lovely face appear. And I did want to point to the really powerful series that she and Dr. Mary Jane Logan McCallum authored for Active History, which ran this week and is going to, I think, spark further conversations about history, commemoration, and violence. And so a shout out to Dr. Alexander and Dr. McCallum. I realize I only have 5 minutes and I've already sort of wanted to change everything that I had planned to say, but I will try and stick to my original notes, and I look forward to the conversation. I want to explain that my engagement with questions of human rights really originates in my research on the history of refugees and the way that rights discourses have been used to advocate for the rights of refugees, but also to advocate or create a sense of responsibility to people who have been displaced, often across international borders. And if you look at the way rights discussions have evolved around refugee issues historically, they come and go. Sometimes it's about a humanitarian impulse, sometimes it's a rights-based impulse. And that certainly has been true over the course of the pandemic, where refugees, especially those refugees in camps in crowded conditions, have been some of the most vulnerable and hard hit by the impact of the pandemic. In part as well because of travel restrictions, which make it very difficult for people to move, to be resettled, and so on. So this is the origins of my own interest in human rights, and so I engage quite specifically with the scholarship on human rights, and that's sort of what I want to speak to today. I really appreciate the invitation to participate because it gave me an opportunity to reflect on the actual writing of human rights history and what I would call a genealogy of human rights. For those of you who are also engaged in the specific study of human rights as a discourse and a practice and legal instrument, you will know that one of the great debates in the field is about where human rights and the idea of universal human rights comes from. And so people spend a lot of time tracing a genealogy going back to the French and American revolutions, British civil liberties, pointing in particular to efforts after the Second World War, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and later the two covenants on human rights. And what is remarkable to me as I think about this question of commemoration and human rights is the way that the work of historians in writing this history is in fact a form of commemoration, of saying this is important to human rights history and this is not. And what I find, I think, increasingly disturbing with this focus on genealogy and the question of where do human rights come from is that we have found ourselves, I would argue, almost in a kind of rut where earlier scholarship has established that it's a Western liberal tradition, and we have followed that through. And unfortunately, what that means is that as we write the history of human rights and we commemorate major milestones in the history of human rights, we often do so at the expense of other voices, other ways of thinking about being in the world, other epistemologies. And so my concern today that these are new ideas for me, so I'm excited to share them with you. But my concern is that the work of historians themselves has in fact done considerable damage, because in our efforts to pinpoint origins, we've excluded a number of voices, a number of different ideas that I think are absolutely critical and essential to the history of human rights. But I also think that that silencing, that marginalization, and that exclusion also tells us a great deal about the limitations of human rights as they exist currently, and about the possibilities if we start to rethink, go back to earlier histories and incorporate different voices. So I've completely lost track of time, so I'll just use an example from my recent research to make this point. I was, as Adele mentioned, I'm working on histories of sanctuary, and so I've been exploring the early history of sanctuary in Montreal, looking specifically at the question of the extent to which the Underground Railroad for enslaved peoples existed to and from Montreal. So I've been doing a great deal of work looking at histories of protection and refuge amongst the Black community in Montreal. And I was looking at community histories, and it was in these histories that I found reference to the 1920 Declaration of the Rights of the Negro Peoples of the World, which was an initiative by the Universal Negro Improvement Association led by Marcus Garvey, which had as its goal full emancipation, a return to an African homeland, and a vision for a fully emancipated world. And this was jarring to me because in all of my, and I like to think I've read a fair bit about human rights, but I had never seen a reference to this 1920 declaration in any of the major works that look at tracing this history of human rights. It is a more radical version of rights. It is one that comes out of resistance. And before I forget, I will very quickly share my screen so you can see just a little bit of, this is a problem with me trying to talk and share a screen at the same time. Here we go. But it is a declaration that has 12 principles, 54 points. I actually wrote about it in Active History recently, so you can go and look at the full declaration there. But I want to just emphasize how important this declaration is, not only for how it reflects the concerns of a particular community that was racialized and marginalized in larger declarations of rights, but how I actually think so much of what is at the core of human rights and how they have evolved is in fact captured in things like this declaration, also in terms of Indigenous epistemologies of rights. And so I really would make a big pitch for, as we think about commemoration, and Omeasoo made this point about there are all kinds of different ways of commemorating, but I also think we need to think about who is doing this commemoration, who are we listening to, and how can we change the kinds of people involved in the conversation. So I will leave it there. Thank you so much. Forward to the discussion. And I need to stop sharing. There we go.
Thank you very much, Laura, for that really rich and important, I think, engagement with not simply kind of questions of commemoration and critiques of it, but also of the way that historians have and have not address these questions and where we might think about kind of going into the future. So thank you very much for that. I will introduce now our fourth and final speaker before we move to having conversation amongst the panelists. And I think you can already get a sense just from how many themes kind of cut between all of these talks, how rich that is going to be. And then we will also take questions from the wider community that has joined us at that point as well. But our fourth speaker is Sean Carleton, who is an assistant professor in the departments of history and Native studies here at the University of Manitoba. His research examines histories of settler colonialism, capitalism, and schooling in Canada, amongst other things. And he is currently teaching a course on Canadian history and commemoration. And we are really honored that Sean is here with us now at the University of Manitoba and able to join us on this roundtable today. So I'll turn things over to Sean.
Okay, well, thanks to Adele for inviting me to participate in this important roundtable, and to my fellow panelists for their opening contributions. And thanks to everyone for taking some time on a Friday afternoon to be part of this important discussion. As Adele mentioned, I'm currently teaching a course on Canadian history and commemoration this semester at the University of Manitoba, loosely based on similar courses developed by Adele, El Chenier, and Laura Ishiguro. And I've enjoyed learning from my students and getting their takes on different kinds of history and commemoration debates, from looking at commemorations of enslavement and abolition, treaty, residential schooling, to remembering war, women's suffrage, workers' rights, and queer struggles, among other topics. Over the course of the semester, we've looked at the history of these events and movements, with particular attention being paid to how they've been commemorated or remembered or forgotten, and how all of this changes over time. I've been especially grateful to my students for their generous contributions to the class that have helped me to better understand the politics of commemoration. And I want to bring some of this to our discussion today. Specifically, I want to put forward the idea that all commemorations are political, and by necessity, all commemoration debates are also political, and that we as historians can actually lean into this. Commemorations, of course, are not in and of themselves history, and thus removing statues or changing names of buildings does not erase history, as some suggest. Instead, commemorations serve a specific purpose. They are symbols or markers of a selective remembering of the past that says much about the politics of the present in which they were made, and the future their funders, designers, and creators envisioned. What my students have helped me to better understand then is that if all commemorations are political, then what is really being debated in today's commemoration or statue wars is what kind of history is most useful for bringing about the present and future people want to see today. So let me use Johnny MacDonald here as a quick example. MacDonald in his own time was a controversial figure, as historians such as Robbins have outlined. It was only after his death that he really became lionized and mythologized as a cornerstone of Canada's nationalist mythology. In fact, as Adele Perry has pointed out, most statues and commemorations of MacDonald were not even erected in the immediate aftermath of his death, but rather in the 1960s and 1970s during the identity debates surrounding Canada's centennial and the growing Quebec sovereignty movement, where MacDonald was used politically as a symbol to try and unite French and English interests and to anchor Canada's national identity. The problem now is that in today's political climate, that remembrance of MacDonald does not serve the same purpose. In the era of truth and reconciliation, as more people are learning about the full history of people like MacDonald, including his support of starvation politics and his central role in initiating, approving, and defending the Indian residential school system, what was once supposed to be a symbol of unity is in a different historical moment, with changing politics and perspectives, an uncritical celebration of an architect of Indigenous genocide, which is proving unhelpful in promoting reconciliation. And that's why MacDonald has become such a lightning rod in these debates. So we might not all agree on the tactics being used to draw attention to these kinds of commemorations, be it graffitiing or toppling statues. But in many ways, these debates, as contentious as they might seem, are exactly what the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's final report, which is 5 years old this month, encourages us to do. So let me just end with a reminder from volume 6, chapter 5 of the TRC's final report, and this is on pages 161, 162. So here the commissioners write, "We believe that true reconciliation can take place only through a reshaping of a shared national collective memory of who we are and what has come before. The youth of this country are taking up this challenge. Reshaping national history is a public process, one that happens through discussion, sharing, and commemoration. As Canadians gather in public spaces to share their memories, beliefs, and ideas about the past with others, and their politics too, I would argue, our collective understanding of the present and future is formed. Public memory is dynamic. It changes over time as new understandings, dialogues, artistic expressions, and commemorations emerge. Although public memory can simply reinforce the colonial story of how Canada began with European settlement and became a nation, the process of remembering the past together also invites people to question this limited version of history. Because COVID is preventing us from physically gathering in public to have these debates, at least we can gather virtually like we're doing today, to keep these conversations going and listen and learn from each other as we talk through these issues of history, human rights, and the politics of commemoration in very strange times indeed. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean, for that. I just want to thank all of the speakers for what were amazingly kind of rich and engaged conversations, and also for like staggering compliance to time guidelines that is unusual in these sorts of, I think everybody was right on point as far as time goes. So that means a couple of things. One, I'm just going to remind everyone, including the audience, that we are recording and we will be posting this on YouTube. And we will be linking to it on the Center for Human Rights Research's webpage and in social media. So if that is a place where you can go to follow up if you want to. I want to now sort of shift to a bit of a conversation between the panelists. And I think I have one kind of question that I'll just throw out as an entry point, and then we can perhaps move to other questions that other panelists may have for each other. And I think one of the tensions that is shot through all of these discussions is the kind of tension between the discussion that really sort of rests at the level of the symbolic and the kind of titular, and then the way that that can kind of occlude or at least help to avoid more sort of substantive discussions about sort of structure and real social change. And I guess my question is whether these discussions about things like naming and statues can be an entry point for those more substantive changes, or whether they are permanently a distraction. So I guess I'll just throw that out to everybody on the panel and ask if anybody might be interested in taking that one on to start.
Adele, that is not a small question. But it's a great question, and I'm going to jump in very quickly because I suspect my co-panelists have much more to say on this than I do, but I'm going to be a little bridge. Because what I'm struck by is I wonder if there's really a distinction between symbolism and structure. I think the symbols that we glom onto, they come from the structures of the worlds in which we live. And so I find it a really provocative question because I think it actually makes us push even further and think about, is there a real difference between symbolism and structure? So I maybe will take your question and turn it into another question for Melanie, Omeasoo, and Sean.
Can I go? Or yeah, okay. I guess so thank you both for the original question and then the second question. It's like a game, it's going to be a totally different question, but yeah. I think I would say actually, I think it is important to think about where that line is between symbols and structures. I think it's quite clear that if we think about questions of human rights, I'm thinking about experiences of Black and Indigenous people and struggles for meaningful community self-definition and citizenship, that there are some conversations or some ways, some forms of symbolic engagement that are precisely about not making structural changes. So I think it's really important to recognize that. And I think there is a way in which this debate about commemoration can also be that, right? But I think it doesn't have to be. I think that it is really fascinating to me when we begin to have, so for example, the name of the street that is not far from my house in Toronto, which is Dundas Street, which is named after the rather villainous individual who I described. When you start to look at the name of Dundas Street and unpack, well, where does that name come from? Why is that street named after him? Why is one of the biggest streets named after this individual. And then it starts to open up the question of, okay, well, you know, why are there almost no streets in Toronto named after women? And it turns out there was a specific policy, apparently. I learned that from the person who started the Dundas Street petition, Andrew Lougheed, that there was a policy in the early 20th century, a fellow, one person, who was responsible for naming all those streets. And that process of street naming itself is about creating a settler landscape where everywhere you look, you know, in the paved roads, in the, you know, grid pattern, in the, what you see is a built environment that is a whole monument to white supremacy, to a particular set of economic relationships, to social relationships. So when you just start, it's like these statues and these forms of public commemoration, this is a particular conversation about symbols that's like a thread. When you pull on it, there are all these things that potentially come with it that are, that do lead to these fundamental questions of structures and forms of exclusion. So I think not all symbols are created the same, or not all conversations about symbols are the same. And it is really important that it's so good that we're having a sophisticated conversation about this that allows us to start thinking through, you know, where is it that, you know, authorities are engaging in these conversations about the symbolic in order to not make change? And where can we take these conversations that then lead us to conversations about what kinds of changes are needed?
Yeah, thanks for that, Melanie. Omeasoo, do you want to add something?
I do have something.
Go for it.
Right, okay. So the research that I did for my dissertation, which was a few years ago now, it was based upon, like, I brought obviously my career and Nahio worldview to the research, but tried not to impose those upon the nation that I was doing research with, which was Ha'amen. And the idea behind it was about how built spaces and territorial spaces really do shape how we view the world. So that what Melanie was just saying was really resonating with this person who decided to make all these decisions reflecting a structure that he wanted to see in North America. So I want the entire world to change today, and it's not going to. And so I think there was a book called First Nations Second Thoughts or something, and it was about different contributions of Indigenous peoples to Canadian culture, which is sort of backwards in my opinion. But anyway, so the point was bit by bit. And so because I'm like way over here and the rest of Canada is like way over there, I think bit by bit, if we change the spaces and the symbols slowly that surround us, we can teach ourselves how to be alive in a different structure that has a different meaning entirely to one that we have now. So that's my answer to that question, I guess. I don't know if it reflects, but your turn, Sean.
Yeah, I mean, I think this idea of symbol and substance is an important one. And I think in the last 5 years, I'm just thinking on my last comment there about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And a lot of the report, you know, tries to say that symbolic change is important too. We need big substantive material change, but the report doesn't create this kind of difference between symbolism and substance. It tries to show the relationship between that. And colonialism, of course, it creates meaning and legitimizes those structures through symbolism. And so I think, I can't believe I'm going to quote Conrad Black here, but one of my favorite Conrad Black, he gets it right. He's so wrong that he gets it right sometimes. And in responding to some of the challenges a few years ago to the history of MacDonald, he wrote, if you challenge the legitimacy of MacDonald, then you're really challenging the legitimacy of Canada. Yeah, that's actually kind of the point. And, and I think that's, to answer your question, Adele, is that I think there is a danger of perhaps only focusing on symbolism and not having those deeper discussions. But I think that thinking through and unsettling colonial symbolism as an example can be a way into thinking about how you can envision a different world in thinking about different understandings or perspectives on the past. And I think that, you know, an example here is that you see a lot of, just in the summer, that these symbols, whether it be McDonald in Queen's Park or the McDonald statue in Montreal, we need to remember that the targeting of these statues isn't only an intellectual exercise. It's also an activist project. It's not, I think, insubstantial that these were happening at Black Lives Matter protests, of anti-racist protests, of trying to envision a different society, and that these symbols can function as a way of inviting people to those conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you everybody for those, I think, really, really appropriate responses to what is this kind of artificial dichotomy sometimes. And one thing I also think, just to add a little bit to that conversation, is the other thing, that these are activist projects as well as intellectual ones, but they're also of fairly long-standing duration. Like, we're in a moment now where they have reached a new kind of efficacy, or certainly a new kind of level of attention in a wider kind of media and public. But there has been critiques of the commemoration of McDonald that have been made vigorously, really since McDonald started to be sort of commemorated in kind of a national scale from the 1960s onward. It was points made by Quebecois nationalists. It was points made by Red Power movements. And we are inheriting a certain stage in this conversation, but I think we also need to see how long it has in fact gone on for. So thank you very much for all of that. I'm wondering if the panelists, some of our 4 very esteemed panelists here, have any particular questions you would like to raise to a particular member of the panel or to all of the panel.
Okay, I'll throw a question out there. It's a weird one, as to be expected. So at the very beginning, I was talking about how I was yelling about how this like activism was really art. And it was, to me, very exciting because it was active art and it was citizens engaging in democratic protest through an action of art. And so I kind of felt like I was, as I said, sort of yelling into the wilderness with my opinions. But then I saw at a similar panel to this, but from a different perspective, Cyrus Marcus Ware, who is one of the founders of BLM Toronto, talking about how, as a protest organizer and an activist and an artist, that type of action, exactly as you said, Sean, was very on purpose, very designed, and in fact, very artistic, because it has an overall strategic purpose. So I was wondering, from your perspectives, from everyone else's perspective, how does these ideas of structure, society, history, commemoration, citizen action, and art sort of overlap in your different perspectives?
Can I take this one on? Because thank you. I wish I could have paid you for that question, because that's something I really am excited to talk about. So I don't have an image I can share, but I would invite everyone in the audience to look up the work. I'm going to put his name into the chat, of this artist he's born in Guyana, but he's a British Guyanese artist. If you've never heard of him, his name is Hugh Locke. And I would encourage people to look at, any of his work, but he has a particular one. It's a series called Restoration. And the one that is most sort of wonderful is one called Colston, Colston, which was his reimagining. He never actually got to do this in 3 dimensions, but he draped the statue. So in Bristol, there was, you probably remember the images from the summer of protesters in the UK tipping the statue of a slave trader called Edward Colston, which was a statue that was erected, I think the Colston Monument is actually, again, at the end of the 19th century. And the distinction between, as others have pointed out, when these monuments are commemorated and the moments in which they're commemorated and the kind of work they're meant to do in those particular historical moments, and the fact that that is usually not actually been that long, that's usually quite some distance after the time that the person in question was actually alive. This is something that all of these kinds of imperial monuments tend to share. These monuments to white supremacy tend to share this in common. But so Colston was tipped into Bristol Harbour, but Hugh Locke draped him in his reimagining of this statue in gold jewelry, in bling. And the gold was meant to symbolize, gold was this is what the sort of heart, one of the other commodity, quote unquote, that was at the heart of the transatlantic slave trade was the exploitation of the African continent for gold. The term for the most valuable coin in the old imperial monetary system in Britain was the guinea, because the gold was originally from the African continent. So he sort of decked him out in finery, and of the gaudiest kind. You can't see it. I asked him, did you give him any gold teeth? And he was like, oh, maybe next time. If I ever get to do it in person, for sure. But it was precisely, you know, this like playful, but actually quite serious and far more historically rich engagement with this monument. So Colston is on his way to a museum, I believe. I think they did take him out of the harbor, but they wisely decided not to put him back in his original location. And I think to me, that's one of the best examples of precisely what Omeasoo is saying, that what people are trying, what these monuments and the way that they have stood, the way that they're sort of protected, they're above the streetscape, they sort of look down on everyone, the materials that they're made of, they speak to a particular relationship with the natural world, a sort of extractive relationship, an understanding of how you organize public space. They represent a relationship between the state and the people, just spatially. And people, when they attack these, when they go after these monuments, are trying to redefine all of those relationships. And I think there are different ways to deal with a lot of these monuments. It's not always the same thing. In some cases, they should just be gone entirely. But then there are other cases, yeah, there he is. A much improved, I believe, version of Edward Colston. Another example would be in Martinique. Well, she was torn down this summer, but the statue of Napoleon's wife, Josephine, who was from a planter family in Martinique, and her monument was erected in the mid-19th century, and someone in 1990 removed her head. They guillotined her and daubed her in red paint. And she stood that way for about 30 years without her head and daubed in red paint. As a commemoration of the French Revolution, of the Haitian Revolution. It was an incredible monument. They actually tore it down this summer, a crowd in Martinique. So I think I think there are some monuments that can be reimagined in this way as public re-engagements, where people, we think, well, what would it mean to allow people to redefine these, to use them as public art spaces? How might that look? What might that say if a government actually felt secure enough to allow people to do this? What might that say about how the government imagined its own relationship with its people? What might it say about how it imagined its relationship with its young people, about what constituted meaningful education? Again, there are all of these threads that are unraveled when you think about what would it mean to have a different physical relationship, to be unafraid, for a state to be unafraid to allow people to express themselves that way, and to find a way to permit that in a healthy, democratic way, right? And that's a conversation we need to have that states are kind of afraid to have, because it does, again, raise so many conversations and questions about the nature of democracy and what the relationship between the state and people ought to look like.
Yeah, if I can just build on that. Thanks so much, Melanie. You know, so Colston was obviously toppled and thrown into the drink. He was dressed up. But to kind of build on that, I'm just throwing this into the chat too. In the aftermath of those protests, he was also replaced temporarily, right? That there was another statue put up in his place of a Black Bristol protester, Jen Reed, with her fist in the air, as you know, a reimagining not only of that space, but in terms of what is you know, where society is moving towards. Do we uncritically celebrate this enslaver, or do we celebrate the removal of that kind of history and moving in a different direction? So I think there are also other layers of this idea of reimagining and thinking about history that in many ways these commemoration debates are themselves making history, and that can be remembered, especially over the last 8 to 10 months. You know, we've seen a lot of a lot of movement in terms of different commemorations. Christopher Columbus statues being toppled, Confederate statues being graffitied and becoming art projects and being reimagined in different ways. I think all of this, regardless of what you may think of those tactics, it is creating the possibility of a reimagining, not only of the past, but what the future and present might hold.
Thanks, everyone. I want to jump in just to go back to Omeasoo's point about art and thinking about artistry and protest artistry. And it ties a bit to what Melanie was saying about historicizing these various monuments when they came into being. And I found myself thinking about both of your comments and thinking there was an artist that created these original statues. And wouldn't it be interesting to think about this as a conversation amongst artists across the generations and how different, the vision looks, whether late 19th century and the present. And that also makes me think about questions of accessibility. I mean, public monuments we can access them. They are intimidating and imposing on pedestals and so on, but we actually can access them, maybe in a way that we can't access commemorations that are within the museum. So the mention of Colson being moved into a museum almost as though to protect him somehow. Mm-hmm. And so I do think about questions of space, where we are seeing these commemorations. And I might just use that as a little segue for a question to my co-panelists before I lose this thread, which is, I was really struck. I think, Sean, you talked about the significance of commemorations in terms of national history. And Omeasoo, you talked about the possibility of commemorating in all kinds of different sites, local communities, homes, and across the nation. And then, Melanie, you were talking about what is essentially a transnational commemoration, right? Debates in Scotland and how they look different. And I was wondering about, Sir John A. Macdonald has these Scottish origins, and how might we think about rights and commemoration in all of these different contexts if we start to think about the ways commemorations are mapped and connected? So I wondered if any of you had thoughts on that, because I'm really struck about in terms of the scale of this conversation.
Sure, just very briefly. One of the things, thinking about a bit of a trans-imperial frame here, is that a few years ago, Highclere Castle, I think I'm getting that right, I'm trying to Google at the same time, Highclere Castle is Downton Abbey, for those of you who are familiar with that show, and that's where John A. Macdonald actually visited, not the Downton Abbey, the Highclere Castle part, where he was kind of working through Confederation in the British North America Act. And they recently have decided to accent that history. They hadn't commemorated or talked about that, and they wanted to, I think they contacted me, they were planting a tree outside Downton Abbey. And they were contacting me to think about, is this a good thing or a bad thing? And then I sent them an article that I wrote, and then they never contacted me again. I think they were looking for Conrad Black. I don't know who put them in touch with me, but I think we need to be aware that when we're looking at these commemoration debates, that there are threads that go beyond sort of the local, and that what was going on in the United States over the summer had impacts all around the world, as we saw. There was sort of a cascade effect of all of a sudden people were wanting to reckon with those colonial roots, whether it be in Bristol or British Columbia. And I think that conversation is both a local and a global one. And I think it's important to pay attention to those threads.
Can I say something else here? And I'll try to be concise, which I'm not very good at, but I think even going back, so, I'm from the Caribbean, and it's interesting, at the point in the 1960s when all these statues of Sir John A. Macdonald are going up, there's a huge debate in much of the English-speaking Caribbean, which at that point was gaining independence between the 70s and the 60s, 70s to 80s, over commemoration. So this is a period where you do have other kinds of monuments, usually still in that same artistic mold. so statues of Marcus Garvey. So the statue of Marcus Garvey in Jamaica, statue to rebellion leader Paul Bogle. Like there are also, it's a period of a lot of debate, and we could have a whole other discussion. I actually have a lecture in one of my classes about how public monuments have changed. They have changed significantly in the Caribbean, and what you have now are monuments actually to slavery and to loss, which was not the conversation that newly independent governments necessarily wanted to have. So you have much more, very different kinds of monuments now. And I'd point people to one. It's in a place in Martinique. It's quite beautiful. It's called Oscata. I'll put it here. It's a monument to the wreck of a slave ship and the loss of the lives of the people on that ship. But in terms of the transatlantic, like the sort of global scale, we have to go back and think about things like the Rhodes Must Fall movement. So this is the movement in post-apartheid. It began in post-apartheid South Africa, but around Cecil Rhodes, that the Confederate monument debate is older. So there are the spaces, often it is spaces, it has often been spaces outside of, in a way, the most privileged spaces of the global north. So places like the Caribbean, Southern Africa, the US South, where these debates actually sort of began, and they've gathered steam. And what we've seen this summer is actually part of a longer history of this kind of, this questioning about what it is that these monuments represent. But I would even go back to, and I think it's really important in terms of looking at models of thinking about questions of commemoration, slave castles on the West African coast, and what states across Western Africa, the coast of West Africa, have like the way that they engage with those monuments. Like, so obviously they play a slightly different role. They are part of a tourism economy, but they're also commemorative sites, they are heritage sites, but those are often not included in these conversations, which itself is a legacy of the way that race shapes these debates. The fact that John A. Macdonald himself was also, he was married to an heiress to a Jamaican plantation legacy. He shows up as having received payment for compensation payments as a slave owner at the end of abolition. So there's so much in terms of like, so even the fact that in the 1960s, when these monuments to him are going up, that's the decade of the 60s scoop. But the Confederation itself is inseparable from the Indian Act. I mean, Confederation was part of a sort of trans-imperial creation of a system of white supremacy, of white supremacist government in an empire that didn't acknowledge that that's what it was based on in any legal sense. But you have, it's part of a rolling process that ends with the sort of early acts that establish apartheid in the early 20th century. So you have the creation of these dominions, precisely as, the whole point of being a dominion was that you were a white settler majority gaining control over, a non-white colonized indigenous population. That was what it meant to be a real government, what it meant to be a real people. And so Confederation is part of that. And it happens in the same decade that British Caribbean territories had these self-governing legislatures since the 18th and 19th centuries. Almost all of those are abolished in the 1860s and 1870s because those are the decades in which they would have come to be controlled by the voting power of ex-slaves and their descendants. So they're directly connected. There is no way, this is the thing with John A. Macdonald, there is no way to separate his legacy from a broader legacy of white supremacy that, is transnational in its scope.
Yes, absolutely. So thank you, Professor Newton. That should be like a textbook. That should be like that response you gave should be the core of a way that we reapproach Canadian history within its context of transnational and trans-imperial politics, and the way that anti-Indigenous racism and colonization is intimately connected with anti-Blackness and histories of slavery and abolition. And that is a perfect kind of way to kind of summarize a whole lot of things that has been said. There's a lot going on in the chat function, which I think some of you can see. People have suggested other things that folks might check out to read, to look at. So I'd encourage you to have a look there if you are able to. And I will also, I think at this point, I can move to some of the questions we've already received from folks who've been able to join us. And I'm going to begin with one from Gus Watanabe. And the question there is, how do we bridge the divide with people who are literally offended by what they see as a dismissal of McDonald? How do we build bridges for communication with people that don't want those bridges to be built so that they'll be willing to listen? So that is the first question that I'll take for that. And I'm just wondering if there's anybody in particular that might want to speak to that from the panel.
I had to explain to some friends today about why I spend so much time educating white people. But there's a few reasons. First of all, I think it's an Indigenous ethic that made this country in the first place, to embrace people. But I think there are two ways that I try to draw people into my conversation, and I don't know how effective they are, but I use them anyway. One of them is to demonstrate, and everybody who works in human rights, I think, knows this and believes it and feels it also, is just how people who feel like they're outside of this conversation actually gain as being part of the conversation. So if I'm talking about poverty, and these aren't my areas, but if we're talking about poverty, if we're talking about homelessness, if we're talking about parabilities, if we're talking about racism, if we all target our most marginalized populations and bring them and create a world that's more equitable, then also people who are white will benefit. People who are white and poor, people who are white with parabilities, people who are white who feel marginalized. Everyone will actually gain if we support marginalized communities. And I also think, like, I had to do a lot of personal battle when I was younger about just like my very existence as an Indigenous person, like what made me Indigenous. And yeah, I just think we don't have to justify ourselves, but at the same time, we'll all benefit in this conversation if we draw people in. So I try to also use rhetorical strategies. My mom was like, I never use rhetoric. And I was like, all right. But yeah, use rhetorical strategies to reflect the conversation that people themselves are having, so that I can speak in their language. And so, yeah, those are my two strategies, is just sort of demonstrating how we all benefit from taking a different approach to how we can live. And we will all be a part of this family. As I mentioned at the last of my discussion, we can create a family and bring everybody in, as opposed to trying to create exclusion where only some people benefit. And that includes white people of all of these different categories that are also not benefiting. And we all have people in those categories in our families, or at least I do. I have them in all my families, and all of my friends have people in all of those areas in all of their families. So if we value each other, we can draw each other into the conversation as opposed to excluding each other.
Yeah, just to build on that, one of the things in the formulation of your question, Gus, is I see a lot of people view, say, the targeting of McDonald or talking about the history of residential schools as an attack, which I find kind of strange. And I think what's really going on there is that a particular memory of McDonald or a particular telling of residential school history feels like an attack. And instead, what I try to do is explain how understanding a more complicated understanding of the past is actually an invitation into the work of trying to make the world or society that you live in better. And so rather than feeling like it's something that you're losing, it's inviting people into a conversation about how you can make things better. And I think that's one of the bridge building things that needs to happen, is rather than debating, is McDonald a nation builder or a nation destroyer? He's both, obviously. And having a conversation about grappling with that, and how perhaps we can reimagine McDonald commemorations or other kinds of commemorations, helps move us in the direction of building a better society. And I think that trying to show people how that's not a threat or an attack can help at least bridge some of those build some of those bridges.
Thank you for that. I'll also just note a note from Armando Perla in the chat, who made a comment, I think, in response to Omeasoo's point about radical love. So I'll just sort of call our attention to that as well. Did any of the other panelists want to speak to that particular question? Melanie or Laura? No. Okay.
Oh, I think I'll say, maybe to follow on the radical love point. Yeah. There is I've actually looked for this to see if it's just my interpretation of him or if he wrote it somewhere, but there's the Trinidadian Marxist thinker, C.L.R. James, has, either he has this concept of, or I interpret his work in this way, but this a certain sort of revolutionary civility in how you engage with people. And I think it is another, maybe a way, like when I think sometimes it's hard with some people to imagine thinking of love with certain people. Like I think about some of the comments I've received in my email from after I've given talk, like spoken in public about this question of commemoration, received some very interesting messages. But I've used that idea or that approach of revolutionary civility as a way to think about, how do I want to respond to this person who fundamentally, as soon as I raise what is really an intellectual point, or about which I do know a great deal, I'll get emails, questioning, when did you come to Canada? Like, you should be grateful to be here, and all that kind of, exactly, and just like, how do you engage? So I always put those two words at the front of my thinking about revolutionary civility as a guiding principle for how to speak. And that may mean telling someone you are completely and utterly misguided. You have been utterly miseducated, and that is an act of violence against you, even if you don't recognize it as such. And even if you have experienced what is in fact an act of violence as the illusion of privilege, right? So, yeah.
Emails. I'm wondering if I could ask a question to the panelists and to the other folks on this call, and this goes back to something that Omeasoo and I were talking about earlier in the fall, when she was doing a lot of this John A. Macdonald work, and the kind of strange and inappropriate and often very threatening emails and comments that historians that are doing public-facing work receive. I'm the face of privilege, and death threats and things that come my way I experience differently than other colleagues in the profession. I'm wondering, like, how do we, as historians doing some of this work, approach sometimes the responses that we get, and I'm wondering, what best practices we as a profession can build in, to how that functions, and how we might be able to respond or not respond to that.
Well, I think Sean raises a really important question here. I mean, we've framed this framing of both revolutionary civility, of radical love, but Sean also raises this question that what are the very real costs, as does Melanie and Omeasoo as well, of doing this kind of work in a public way, and what I think can we do to support each other, both structurally and maybe informally, to make these conversations easier to carry for us as individuals and as communities. And how also do we recognize that we all do not enter this public online world with the same things at stake. And these are responses that vary enormously depending on gender, but also a whole range of intersectional issues, and in particular the ways that racialized and Indigenous women in particular often bear the brunt of a great deal of hostility and violence online, is something that really needs to be built into any conversation that we have when we imagine what this could look like. So I don't know if that's something that some of our other panelists might like to speak to.
I might jump in and just quickly say that it's an important question, because I think it brings with it ideas and around, you know, our responsibilities as researchers and scholars working, I think we're on public institutions. You know, what happens when we decide to engage, because not everyone does do public facing work, right? And so what is the responsibility when we do decide to do that? It is, you know, a tremendous opportunity to be able to share work and ideas publicly. And I confess that when I've done so in the past, I've never read the comments online, because I have very thin skin, and I know that I will, you know, start to doubt myself, and I feel very strongly about the work that I do, but I know that the comments don't always come from a kind place. And so I have a colleague who very helpfully reads them and tells me what I need to be paying attention to in terms of larger issues. So there needs, you know, I think when we do this public facing work, we should never be doing it alone, right? We should be thinking about other people who we share ideas with, who could also participate in these conversations. But I will say that I had the experience of writing for The Conversation this spring, and the philosophy behind The Conversation is that the authors engage with the comments. So I actually did have to read the comments, and they were racist. This was a piece that I'd written about anti-Asian sentiment and, you know, the plight of refugees in the early days of the pandemic. And they confirmed my worst suspicions about the public dialogue. And so, you know, there is this question about the forums that we engage with, and, you know, both as researchers, but also people who want to you know, maybe people are looking for a dialogue when they participate in these public forums, or maybe they're just venting. I haven't quite figured it out, but I think we see the best and worst in these public forums, and I do believe in doing this work with people who will hold my hand and read comments for me and all those good things. So it's not work that I don't think anyone can do it alone.
Absolutely, yeah. Does anybody else want to weigh in on that one? Okay.
I'll just say that I clearly can never speak again without all of you there, because you make sense of what I have to say. Thank you.
Yeah, you know, and these projects are collective, right? And I think that it's really important the way that this has kind of come out in this conversation about the way that we can do this together in a way that we have to. And I'll also confess that, like Laura and Omeasoo, I also do not read the comment sections when I publish things, and I sometimes have to put out reminders that I need to be hauled back from doing it, because I find them very kind of difficult and destructive, but I also want to keep doing that work. But I also realize that that's something that my whiteness and my age also mitigates as well. And I think it would be very different if I was a different sort of woman scholar in this particular game. So I have another kind of I have a great many questions from folks who have been able to join us, but I want to raise one that comes from Jessica Herdman. And it goes back to one of the comments that Omeasoo made earlier, and asks us to think about the intersection between the symbolic and the substantive that might take place in specific types of cultural commemoration, and in particular ones that require action and embodiment. So as opposed to things like statues or other kind of fixed material objects. So thinking in particular about musical commemoration, but more generally about different types of cultural communications. I don't know if that's something that anybody would like to sort of speak to right off the hop. So Jessica adds here famous musical examples that she includes there in the chat as well. But thinking a little bit about how we commemorate things that are not just, or how we discuss commemoration of things that are not simply objects, but also performative.
Yeah, just off the top of my head to throw this out is, I remember a couple of years ago when there was a discussion about changing the lyrics of "O Canada," and people were losing their minds that it was, you know, I think, I have all these ideas and then I need to look them up, but I think it was like changing it from, you know, like it was a gendered language to a non-gendered language, and people were like, very upset. And then someone was pointing out that, well, the original was closer to what it was being changed to. And I thought, this idea of, what music and anthems and all of these things stand for, of course, change over time, and people get very attached to certain versions without really understanding their larger context. And that's the first thing that sort of comes to mind in that sense of, what are anthems fixed, or do they change in ways that, they're more fluid than perhaps people realize?
Yeah, absolutely.
I think, I don't know if this is off a tangent of sorts, but it strikes me that music can also be an incredible force for commemorating histories of human rights that might otherwise be lost. I'm working on a piece right now about a gentleman named Weldon Chan, who was deported from Canada in 1958. His story is really hard to find, but I found it because it was a folk song that was recorded and released on the Smithsonian Folkways label. It's now available on YouTube. It sticks in your ear and you can't get rid of it. But this is an example of music that actually helps us understand a part of our history that we might not otherwise have encountered. And so I would, in my Pollyannish way, suggest that there's actually some power to music as commemoration.
I would say, so two quick answers to that. So obviously there's no way to unpack this fully here, but in the national religion of Haiti, which is voodoo, which is completely misunderstood out, in North America for a whole host of reasons to do with the same history. The pantheon of gods in voodoo, the Loa, L-O-A or L-W-A, doesn't matter. Either one is correct in Creole, are ancestor gods. And they're a range of different ancestors. They're not just good. It's not just, creating people as ancestors because they've done good things, but ancestor gods are figures who have important lessons to teach. And it's a whole complex world of deification and so on. But I think one of the things, as we connect some of these questions to some of the radical rethinking that we have to do about how we live in the world, because of the various crises we face, not least of them the climate crisis, I think really making space for thinking not just about the past, but about ancestors, which is the part of how so voodoo is a register of history. It's a philosophy of relationship between the past and the present, and making space for thinking about that kind of performance of thinking about ancestors and not just about the past. I think this is a moment where, particularly now with COVID, we're seeing some of the consequences of the really impoverished way in which capitalist societies think about the old, the elderly, and to go back to where Omeasoo began, about death. And the other thing I would say about some of the broader, and maybe this is off topic, but some of the anxiety that is created for some people by, saying that we maybe should rethink the presence of some of these public commemorations. Think about the cycle of our own lives and the fact that, the whole cycle of nature and of human existence and of organic life is that, you make space for other things. Like you have your time, and you make space. And I think it is true that it is important to have things in society that are multi-generational. And that will always include some conflict over what things mean over time, changes in their meaning, disagreement over, that's inevitable. But there is a way in which these forms of commemoration as sort of performance it's almost like a way for these figures to cheat death, which I think is a central element of imperialism's thought. And that this idea that as humans, like it's this performance of immortality, to try and tie in this point to what was said before in a really artificial way, but yeah, and I think recognizing that none of our forms of commemoration should proceed from either that total lack of respect for thinking about about ancestors, or that idea that we can achieve that kind of immortality. Right? That's a conceit.
As you're speaking there, Melanie, I'm also thinking of another example of kind of sound death and rebirth in the work of Jeremy Dutcher. who I'm just going to put his link there in the chat. One of his more recent records works with the Wāhpāsiw language, and he starts off that record with a death chant. And what he's doing is he's taking these older recordings and he's re-envisioning them for a more contemporary audience, and he's trying to challenge this stereotype of Indigenous languages dying, and he's sort of trying to breathe new life through music and recordings, and kind of combining and rewriting these old recordings with sort of a newer envisioning or a different soundscape that's trying to breathe new life into these languages. And I'm thinking, Jessica, that might be a really good example, that record, as sort of a commemoration, but also one that's trying to bring new life into Indigenous language through art and recording.
Well, thank you to everyone here. There is a host of actually really fantastic questions that are in the chat box here, and I had kind of a list going of the ones we were going to get to, but I realized that we are coming up on the end of our designated time. And so I think what I will do is I will just ask the panel for one sort of moment, if you had any kind of final sort of thoughts that you wanted to share with Toute la Gang. This would be a moment where you are welcome to do so. So is there any final comments or remarks you'd like to offer to the audience, to all of us, to each other? Okay.
Can I make one, just a little funny
Absolutely.
comment?
Yeah.
Well, I think it's funny, maybe other, but so when I first came to Canada as a student to Montreal, I was at McGill, and I fell in with these student journalists, this radical student newspaper, and I think partly as a joke, my friends at the time who were Canadian born taught me "O Canada" as our home on Native land. And that's genuinely what I thought it was for years. I should have known better. But just to say, that the more, so in some ways, the more truthful reimagining of our relationship again with these symbols sometimes happens in very unexpected ways. When I hear "O Canada," that's what I hear. So.
And I will just add to that and say it's one of those things as well. This says something about repetition and the way symbols get turned around, is that once you have heard it that way, you can't hear it any other way. Like as soon as that moment of hearing that song is radically shifted. And I think that tells us also something about what we were talking about today. Well, I will just conclude by offering my enormous thanks to a couple of people, to Helen Falding and Denise McInnes from the Center for Human Rights Research, who have both been here managing all the arrivals and departures and questions and all of the logistical ends of all of this. So thank you very, very much. And I would thank the four amazing panelists, all of whom I will say are people I could listen to all day. And it was a real honor to hear people talk about their work and their thoughts about these important questions, but also to get a chance to hear people think together. And it is always kind of an honor and a privilege to do that, particularly in a moment of real difficulty and real struggle, where we know that these things count, and where that makes our work more pressing, but also in many ways harder, but also all the more urgent. So it was an enormous honor to be joined by Doctors Omeasoo, Wāhpāsiw, Melanie Newton, Laura Madokoro, and Sean Carleton. And we will be putting up the recording, and we will be further in touch, and stay tuned for events that are coming from the CH Center for Human Rights Research in the new year, including an event on the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in early February. So I will bring things to a close. Thank you.